Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be finishing our book, The Driver's Story. It talks about rebellion and what it was like to be a driver in rebellion and some of the complex questions that they faced. Let me know what you think in the comments. The Driver's Story. Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery by Randy M. Brown. We're on chapter 5, which starts on page 113 and is titled Rebellion. Sometime around Christmas in 1813, Alexander grew suspicious. The head driver on Bath, one of many cotton plantations spread across Berbice's west coast, he heard rumors that other enslaved Africans had been secretly gathering at night for the past several weeks or months. Alexander also heard that those gatherings had been organized so that enslaved people could appoint leaders to preside at the festivals and funerals of the different nations to which they belonged. Such assemblies, where people came together away from the prying eyes of white authorities to eat, drink, and socialize, dance, bury their dead, and pledge support for one another, were relatively common in Caribbean slave societies. But the most recent gatherings were private. Alexander had not been invited, and when he began to wonder if the organizers had more sinister motives, Alexander decided to investigate. Concluding that he would be unwelcome, he sent a spy. He asked Bacchus, another enslaved man on Bath, to attend future meetings and to enter into the spirit of it. If the organizers asked Bacchus to swear an oath of secrecy, for instance, he was to take it so as to deceive the party plotting. Then he was to report to Alexander all that would pass. What Alexander learned from his informant was alarming. Supposedly, plans were underway for a major uprising. Several plantations along the west coast, which stretched some 25 miles from Berbice's border with Demerara to the mouth of the Berbice River, were involved. Among the leaders, or officers, were several drivers, including 3 men from the same plantation where Alexander lived. Alexander also heard that Africans of many nations, including Coromantes, who were from the Gold Coast, Congas, who were from the western Windward Coast, and Congos, who were from the West Central Africa region, were involved. They were united in a common goal: overthrow the whites and the establishment of the authority of the blacks. Alexander's inquiries would turn out to be only the beginning of a much larger investigation. Starting in February of the following year and continuing for several months, colonial authorities interrogated more than 100 people from the dozens of plantations, including some 20 drivers. Almost all of those interrogated were men. This reflected the gendered assumptions of colonial officials. The decisions enslaved men made when it came to rebel organizing, the demographic dominance of enslaved men in the colony, and perhaps the strategic silence of enslaved women. Some witnesses were interrogated at Government House in New Amsterdam, the colony's ramshackle capital and only urban center, and others were questioned hastily in assembled courts on various plantations. Government officials and individual slave owners alike pressured suspected ringleaders, participants, and bystanders to tell them what they had done, seen, and heard. The questions enslaved witnesses were asked, and the answers they gave or refused to give were carefully recorded by colonial authorities. Surviving testimony spans some 600 handwritten pages. Why investigators wanted to know: had African nations assembled and appointed officers? Was there really a rebel plot, and if so, how far did it stretch? The mountain of evidence generated during the investigation into this little studied uprising offers an opportunity to build on the rich tradition of scholarship about the organization, leadership, and politics of Caribbean slave revolts by focusing on the drivers at their center. Historians have long recognized that rebellions across the Caribbean and in other Atlantic slave societies were often organized and led by drivers. Enslaved drivers played dominant roles in rebellions both in slave societies like 19th century Barbados, where most enslaved people had been born in the Americas, and in places like 18th century Jamaica, where Africans predominated. We also know that rebellions from Antigua in 1736 to Cuba in 1825 were frequently organized by the leaders of different national or ethnic groups, and that rebels' previous experience in Africa, particularly as veterans of war, shaped their military strategies and political visions. The 1813 to 1814 uprising also highlights the multiple, contradictory, and pivotal roles of drivers in rebellion. Many African-born drivers were leaders in the national groups that were at the center of the planned rebellion, which they saw as an opportunity to construct a new political order that would serve their own interests. Other drivers, meanwhile, tried not to get involved while keeping quiet, and some drivers actively betrayed the rebellion. Exploring the 1813 to 1814 uprising thus offers an opportunity to ask a new series of questions about what drivers meant for rebellion and what rebellion meant for drivers. What role did drivers' leadership in African national groups play in forming or undermining the kind of solidarities and political communities that were necessary to organize a successful rebellion? What motivated drivers like Alexander, when confronted with a rebellion in the making, to make the excruciating decision to support, avoid, or oppose the rebel cause? When drivers did organize and lead a rebellion, how did their previous experiences, memories, and investments in hierarchical political structures shape their politics and plans for the future? How does an internal enemy become an internal enemy? This is what we want to know. To make the country good. Whatever Alexander heard about the secret meetings that took place in late 1813 Only fragments of the many rumors spreading across the colony reached him. Subsequent investigations would eventually reveal dozens of accounts about the origins of the 1813 to 1814 rebel plot. The accounts, often confusing and incomplete, overlapped, intersected, and contradicted one another. Nevertheless, from those accounts, one can piece together three major narratives, all of which centered on the activities of different nations and their leaders. For drivers, national associations presented both challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, since nations were not limited to individual plantations and memberships in them was defined by ethnic identity rather than geographic proximity, drivers had no inherent political authority over these alternative socio-political communities. On the other hand, national associations offered African-born drivers an opportunity to extend the geographic reach of their authority, seeking followers beyond their own plantations. Some drivers also used nations to claim an additional basis of political authority by seeking or accepting appointments as kings, governors, or officers. Doing so, however, inevitably brought them into conflict with other big men. National associations, in one form or another, were common in slave societies throughout the Americas, and the result of an ongoing process of ethnogenesis or group identity construction. During the era of the transatlantic slave trade, displaced Africans from the same broad region, who sometimes spoke similar languages and shared cultural similarities, created new identities as members of the same diasporic nation, such as the Coromantee or the Akan people from the Gold Coast. In most cases, such people would not have considered themselves members of the same polity or ethnicity in Africa, where they had more localized identities. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. But in the Americas, these broader national identities became socially, culturally, and politically meaningful. In the Caribbean, as elsewhere, national associations played a wide range of day-to-day functions as burial groups, mutual aid societies, organizers of social gatherings, and spaces for shared spiritual practices. At the same time, as political communities, nations were commonly associated with organized collective resistance. Enslavers suspected that national assemblies, which provided enslaved people from different locations opportunities to communicate and coordinate, were a major locus of rebel organizing. The Jamaican planter politician Edward Long, for instance, worried about the nighttime funeral gatherings, commonly called plays, that Coromantees and other nations organized. Their assemblies needed to be surveilled with particular attention, he recommended in his widely read History of Jamaica, written in 1774, because they had always been a rendezvous for hatching plots. Long was not mistaken. Just over a decade earlier, Coromantese had organized what became known as Taki's Revolt, the largest rebellion to date in the island's history. To prevent future rebellions, Long stressed that enslavers need to break that spirit of confederacy which keeps these Negroes, the Coromantes, too closely associated with one another. For drivers, then, there was also the inherent risk that participating in national associations, even when they had no insurrectionary plans, would lead their enslavers to see them as rebels. In Berbice in 1813, many people said the planned rebellion that was commonly known at the time simply as this story began on a plantation called Washington, one of the largest plantations on Berbice's far west coast, which enslaved people who identified as Congos. The first organizer, they said, was a man named Congo Sam. He was a relative newcomer on Washington, but had previously worked nearby on a plantation in eastern Demerara. There, Congo Sam had been what one man called a big man, and although he was just a field laborer in Berbice, at least some of the 240 or so slaves on this new plantation began to recognize him as a head man at Washington. Sometime in late 1813, it seems, Congo Sam began telling other people on Washington that they should reinvigorate Berbice's national associations. He told them how on the plantation where he used to live, which was called the Grove, the Congo nation had a king, a governor, and even a fiscal, which was the same title colonial authorities gave their highest judicial officer. As a result, the story was good. But on Berbice's west coast, as Congo Sam saw it, things were disorganized. So Congo Sam proposed that they implement the same sort of law there, namely that they appoint officers for different nations who would, among other things, care for the sick, organize funerals and festivals, and adjudicate disputes involving theft. The illicit nature of such nations, their association with rebellion, and the resulting secrecy with which enslaved people organized along national lines makes it difficult to gauge the extent to which national organizations operated in the region before 1813. But scattered references offer some revealing clues. In 1808, enslaved men in Demerara who identified as Congos and were arrested on suspicion of having planned a rebellion told authorities that a few years earlier it had been customary for several years for every nation to choose headmen and kings under whom were several other subaltern officers of the same nation. They also said that the duties of these kings were to take care of the sick among those of their respective nations by purchasing rice, sugar, and other provisions for them, to take care of, at the burials of their dead, that the corpses were properly enclosed in a cloth, and the customary rites and dances duly observed. Back then, the District of the Congos had extended from Elizabeth Hall to Luxnian, an area that comprised of 11 plantations. But at some point, a quarrel between members of the Congo nation and their king about his ability to provide burial funds led to the dissolution of the Congo nation, which had since then been without a king or a headman. From that point on, there had been no more assemblies or companies, and instead, those of the nation of each estate had taken care of the interment of their own dead. So it went from a national process to a regional process. To rectify a similar problem in Berbice in 1813, or to make the country good, as some of its witnesses put it, Congo Sam enlisted established leaders with different kinds of authority. He appointed Monday, the existing headman for Washington's Congos, as governor, and Romeo, a Congo of the plantation's second driver, as fiscal. Congo Sam also included a key leader with ties to a very different region in Africa, the plantation's head driver, Pompey, who was headman of the Mandingos, who were Mandinka speakers from Senegambia. Congo Sam made Pompey their king, or, as one man identified him, King Father at Top. Together, the three leaders began recruiting with other men on Washington and nearby plantations, using their personal connections and charisma to persuade and coerce others to join the nation. A few weeks before Christmas, Pompey organized a series of nightly meetings or suppers at his house, where large numbers of Mandingos gathered along with other people likely to have roots in Senegambia, Bambaras and Fulas. Like many other men with leadership roles in African nations, Pompey did not include women. His own daughter, Margaret, was sent out of the way when they met, like the other women who were all excluded from the supper. Once the men had assembled, Pompey began by appointing several officers, including king, governor, fiscal, lawyer, captain, and shuti, or sheriff. Pompey was cagey, however, about the purpose of these appointments. At the first meeting, one man related Pompey did not say anything about all the officers' responsibilities. It was within Pompey's breast. At the subsequent meeting, Pompey was apparently more explicit and more forceful. He focused on a few people he identified for leadership roles and proposed, as one man put it, that they imitate the good example of the Congos in appointing persons to take care of the sick and their dead, and that each should contribute towards relief of the sick. Other participants said much the same, that the officers were to take care of the sick and bury the dead, and that as no new Negroes come to the country, referring to the end of the slave trade to Berbice 7 years earlier, they are obliged to work so much so much the more, so they must take care of themselves and do that story. When they were interrogated months later, several witnesses claimed that Pompey had forced them to participate. A field laborer from Washington named Hercules said that he rebuffed Pompey's offer to appoint him governor because his house was too near Buckra House, meaning the manager's house. But, according to other witnesses, he ultimately took the role of king or headman. Greenock, a Fula from plantation Weldad, and a Loggy warehouse driver, said he was confined with toothache and declined Pompey's invitation to join the meeting until he was sent for a second time. Even then, Greenock did not go willingly. Pompey had another man tie Greenock and bring him because he was a big man and did not attend the meeting, or as Greenock claimed, because he had refused to accept the appointment as fiscal. Greetings, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast and KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Another Mandingo man who refused to attend also said he was tied to a table by Pompey and two other men. Once there, Greenock approved of the plan, but objected to asking others to contribute money, only to be overruled by Pompey, who said that everyone should give only 1 or 2 bits or coins as their circumstances permitted. Greenock ultimately agreed to be fiscal. He said and told the others that if they brought him money, he would take care of it and bring it to Pompey. As Congo Sam explained, in addition to taking care of the sick and organizing funerals, one of the key functions of national associations was to investigate and punish crimes, especially thefts, committed by other slaves. In the Congo nation, if anyone offended against his countryman, the governor, Monday, would inquire into it and make the offender pay. A primary reason for this story was made. Congo Sam insisted to prevent stealing. It was Monday's responsibility to interfere when any disputes arose and to decide who is right and who is wrong. Enslaved people were to handle these disputes on their own and not to trouble the whites with these things. Washington's second driver, Romeo, explained his role as a fiscal in similar terms. If anything was stolen, he would take the things out of the suspected thief's house and flog him to tell or confess. If the thief did not return the stolen item or had nothing to pay as compensation to the victim, Romeo would punish the thief with a good licking or flogging. If Romeo himself were found guilty, the victim could go to the governor, who would take something from Romeo. So they were creating and had their own little legal infrastructure where they punished one another for committing these crimes against one another, which still works in communities today if we do it right. Under Pompey, the Mandingos and Fulas planned to establish something similar plan to establish a similar system for responding to thefts. Greenock said that as fiscal, he would be the one to whom victims would turn and that he would take effects from the suspected thief to make good what was stolen. If Greenock himself were found guilty of stealing, Pompey said, the victim could appeal to the governor, and if not brought to issue, the matter could be laid before the king, Pompey, himself, who would make Greenock pay or go and fetch wood for punishment. Around the same time that Congo Sam began organizing people on Washington, others were assembling on plantations Union and Trafalgar in the heart of the West Coast. On these neighboring plantations, jointly owned by Scotsman James Fraser and comprising more than 2,000 slaves, Coromantese began meeting officers and appointing officers. The instigator, or the cause of all this trouble, as one man put it, was purportedly a Coromantee man, though identified by some as Cape Lahu, named Archie. Enslaved for an unknown period of time in Berbice, at some point, perhaps several times, Archie traveled to Britain with Fraser. Soon after, Archie returned to Berbice, likely in 1812. He reassembled the area's Coromantee nation. With the help of another Coromantee named Agar, who may have been recognized as the Coromantee king during Archie's absence, Archie began calling Coromantees to a meeting held at the house of the Union's chief driver, Thomas. At the first meeting, Archie told the Coromantees that he was the head man of them and proposed that they appoint several other leaders to serve under him. Holding the meeting at Thomas's was a strategic show of respect as well as a means of getting Africans of other nations to follow the Coromantees' lead, since Thomas was not a Coromantee but a Vai. Then, a few weeks before Christmas, Archie reached out to a longtime Coromantee leader on a nearby plantation to the east, the head driver of Golden Grove, whose name was Kwashi. Kwashi, a variation of Kwasi, an Akan day name for a male born on Sunday, was well known to the people on the Fraser plantations, especially Trafalgar, where one of his wives lived, where he visited regularly. Exactly what arrangement Archie proposed to Kwashi is unclear. In the investigation that followed, no one wanted to admit to having been the leader of an African nation implicated in a rebel plot. Archie said that other men on the Fraser plantations asked him to be the head man of the Coromantees, and that he refused. Kwashi continued in his role as head of the nation. Kwashi and other witnesses, however, placed the blame squarely on Archie. According to a field laborer from Golden Grove, Archie called our driver Kwashi and made him king. Kwashi later claimed that when Archie told him he was to be the governor of the Coromantine, he initially accepted, but at some point afterwards gave it over to Archie. According to Kwashi, Archie thus became the Coromantee governor, and Agar took the title of king. Whatever sort of relationship existed between Archie and Kwashi, both would play key roles in the reinvigoration of the Coromantee nation that spanned multiple plantations. Several Coromantees explained that they appointed officers for the same reasons the Congos and Mandingos did, to take care of the sick, bury their dead, and punish the thieves. Kwashi's primary duty as the Coromantee governor, or chief, he said, was to mind the Negroes when they were sick and bury them properly when dead. Another witness similarly said the officers had been appointed to make, play at, or conduct the burials of the Negroes. Archie said that the two unnamed men who supposedly wanted to make him headman of the Coromantes expected him to preside over them, providing soup and poultry to those who fell ill, and more generally making sure that the sick were properly attended to. The Coromantee fiscal's job, Archie said, was to attend and take care of the sick of the several nations. According to Kwashi, the Coromantee nation also handled accusations of theft. If any robberies were committed by officers or other slaves, Kwashi said, victims would not complain to white authorities but to the Coromantee governor, Archie, and he would make the thief pay. Under Thomas, who was the head driver of Union, and according to some people, the king of the Vais, there was an even more elaborate system of punishing crimes that reified socioeconomic distinctions among the enslaved. So they had socioeconomic distinctions? Okay. According to one witness, the fines for common Negroes or soldiers were different from those for officers. They made a regulation in the event of their quarreling, he said, that common Negroes who troubled one another would have to pay a 6 guilder fine. If the fiscal troubled a common man, he would pay 2 guilders. A general would pay 5 bits, and the governor would pay 3 guilders. Such differentiation suggests that hierarchy rather than egalitarianism was central to the politics of national associations in Berbice. Around the same time, similar developments emerged on the other side of the Berbice River. Along the east coast and farther east along what was known as the Corentyne coast, everything started with Caesar, the head driver on the plantation Lancaster. Caesar had lived in Berbice since at least 1801, Haitian Revolution times. But sometime in 1812, other Congos, along with the Corentyne coast, started to recognize him as their king, or Yanga. Caesar later openly admitted to being king, insisting that the Congo nation he ruled existed only to attend the sick and to play or preside over the dead, or to preside at funerals. Toward the end of 1813, Caesar and other Congos were in the habit of dancing every Saturday night on a different Corentyne coast plantation, Anchorville. A turning point came when a Congo man named Dick died. When Dick's countrymen assembled to bury him, Caesar brought rum to share, fulfilling his customary obligation as a big man, and proposed that they reestablish a more formal Congo nation. Various leaders, Caesar explained, should be appointed to collect contributions for burials from other Congos. According to one man, Caesar said that when a Congo man died, all of them had to join and contribute. To extend the geographic reach of his authority, Caesar and his delegates traveled to several plantations on the Quarantine and East Coast. Caesar's commissary, described as his aide de camp, a man named Apollo from Plantation Liverpool, made several trips to Plantation Kendall's on the East Coast, where he had previously been enslaved, brandishing a stick Caesar had given him to show his countrymen that he was a headman. Apollo explained Caesar's goals. Apollo was particularly keen to enlist the support of a man named John, who was evidently an important Congo leader in the region. If any Congos died on Kendall's, Apollo said, John should send and give notice so that Caesar and his officers could play there. In addition, Caesar hoped to unify the Congos. As Apollo put it, they should do what Caesar has done in the Coromantine and make up all their differences and make headmen. Caesar would soon come and settle the king's business in their quarter. John may have been hesitant, but he eventually played a key role both in the Congo nation itself and in getting Africans who identified as members of other nations to organize their own parallel groups. As often on other plantations, a key turning point on Kendall's emerged during a funeral. After the death of a child, John criticized the Coromantes for not having chiefs and urged them to form their own national association. According to one woman, John said the Congos had kings and governors and fiscals up the quarantine, and that the Coromantes had to do the same there. Clearly, members of different nations in Berbice communicated with and sometimes emulated one another. Some people on Kendall's were opposed. One man said, "This story must not come here," and another was cautioned by his wife not to have any hand in this story. Remember, story means story, and story also means conflict. But John carried on with his plan and enlisted the support of a man named Michael, who identified as Chamba, which was a group with origins in the Bight of Benin. Together, they reached out to a man on a nearby plantation named Sibley, who was an emerging big man or headman among the Chambas. The Chamba Nation in eastern Berbice had also recently coalesced in the wake of a funeral gathering. According to several witnesses, during a funeral dance on plantation Port Morant, there was properly conducted, people proposed that the Chambas appoint a headman so that they could continue this good custom. To fulfill this role, they turned to Sibley, head driver on the plantation Warren. Another Chamba leader named Khan, who was also a driver on plantation Hampshire, asked Sibley via a messenger involving other people in his business if he would help the Chambas do as the Congos were doing, namely, make arrangements for assisting each other by collecting contributions for the burial. Sibley ignored Khan's overtures, until the funeral on Kendall's, which he had attended and which he contributed fowls, bits, and hogs, when he faced renewed pressure from Michael and others to accept the appointment. Sibley ultimately agreed to be the Chamba's king so that he and Khan would share responsibility. If Khan had a dance and a funeral, he would contribute what he could, provided Khan did the same. For the Chambas, who were evidently numerous in eastern Berbice, played a major dispute emerged about the ethnic purity of their nation. Wow. Specifically, whether they should incorporate the region's Coromantese, who came from an entirely different region with no ties to the Chambas. Those tribal differences don't go away. Sibley favored including the Coromantese since there were not many of them, and told Khan he had better take the Coromantese all with him. As a head driver, Sibley no doubt had experience getting enslaved people from different backgrounds to cooperate. But Khan said he would not have the Coromantese, and they would have to handle their funerals on their own. If Coromantese were to come into this story, Khan insisted, Sibley would have to take up himself and settle it. Meanwhile, the Congos grappled with even larger divisions. As Caesar fought to crush rivals and extend his authority across the entire region, forcing others to choose sides. On the East Coast, a major challenge to Caesar's authority came from a man named Jim on plantation Merville. Several others, including John on Kendall's, wanted to make Jim king of the East Coast Congos. It was rumored that John proposed that, just as the Buckras or whites had made a division between the Quarantine or Quarantine and the East Coast, it was necessary to have a king in each region. Even on the coast, however, some Congos saw Caesar rather than Jim as their king, which fed bitter internal rivalries. When Caesar tried to assert his authority after a burial on Gibraltar, a plantation on the East Coast owned by Caesar's former owner, Jim challenged Caesar's authority. At a gathering of the Congos at Christmas, hosted by a woman named Susanna, after her husband's death, Caesar took charge. He told everyone that those who wanted to see the man's grave had to come in about 3 weeks and bring rum and throw upon it. But Jim told Caesar he had no authority to give orders in that quarter. You have your side, Jim said, and we will carry it over here. To directly challenge a head driver and recognized king, a man who expected deference and obedience, was a bold and risky move. John, who continued to back Jim's claim to kingship, tried to negotiate a power-sharing agreement, proposing that Jim serve as governor of the Lower Coast or East Coast. But Caesar openly questioned whether Jim was really able to carry through on his coast. In what some witnesses described as a toast, Caesar sang in Congo language that a leader needed to have a strong hand and a heavy heart, as well as good sense. Jim insisted, I can take it and am as good a playman as you are, and can carry it on as well as you, Caesar. But Caesar thought Jim was an unfit person to hold the post of king. He merely pretended to possess the necessary qualities. The argument about the king's business went unresolved at Christmas because Susanna, in an impressive show of her own authority, kicked everyone out of her house and then drove them away. Susanna kept quiet about what she had seen and heard, and a week later hosted what by all accounts was a much larger gathering at New Year's. There, Caesar returned and showed everyone that he was determined, as he put it, to be king of the whole coast from Coromantine to Kanji. That is, from the eastern border of the colony to New Amsterdam, where the Kanji and Berbice rivers meet. Caesar would not allow any other king. As many people of all nations gathered on Gibraltar for a great dance, Caesar made a grand entrance, carried by 4 attendants in a hammock to show everyone how powerful he was. Caesar arrived a little before daylight, followed by at least 100 supporters who had joined him during the march from his plantation home. His following was obvious and undeniable. On Gibraltar, Caesar received the king's welcome. As Jim bitterly recalled, people began to cry out, "The king is come," and virtually everyone abandoned their rings where they had been dancing to greet Caesar. All the big men, other witnesses said, immediately went to meet Caesar. Caesar shaking hands and paying their respects. Participating in national organizing was inherently risky for drivers, even when nations focused on seemingly benign activities like organizing burials, in part because it forced them to collaborate with other powerful figures with different kinds of authority and social connections. On the plantations where they lived, drivers were used to being on top. Diasporic nations, however, had their own leaders, big men who did not automatically cede power to drivers. As a result, drivers who sought national leadership roles often had to compete for followers and sometimes found their status openly called into question. For everyone involved, the stakes became exponentially higher when people began talking about rebellion. A rising that would take place. West of the Berbice River, the period between Christmas and New Year's was also a major period of transformation for national groups, as enslaved people took advantage of the rare opportunities that the holidays allowed for them to visit friends and family on different plantations. Gatherings became larger and more frequent. At some of them, drivers and other national leaders began to talk about not just managing burials, punishing thieves, or helping the sick, but also about more revolutionary plans. Later reports would emerge that on various plantations, people were in the habit of marching and practicing military evolutions or drills, always at midnight and armed with cutlasses. Rumors also circulated about people displaying flags, making incendiary speeches, and dressing in royal garb. Archie purportedly wore a sash and a cockade on at least one occasion, and about gangs exercising with wooden swords. Like Alexander, many people began to suspect that the national groups had coalesced earlier that year and were planning a rebellion. For drivers, such talk forced them to make excruciating decisions. If they were to lead or even join the rebel cause, how could they figure out whom to trust, how to keep their plans secret, and how to motivate their followers to risk their lives? Those who aimed to keep their distance from what seemed to many like a suicidal plan, meanwhile, had to find some way of dodging an impending war whose combatants would not respect neutrality. And finally, drivers who determined that they had more to lose than to gain in a war against slavery had to decide when and how to stop the coming rebellion. National organizing always evoked the specter of rebellion, including those who had been brutally suppressed. Especially fresh in 1813 and 1814 were the memories of what everyone referred to simply as the Demerara story. This was shorthand for a series of rebellions and rebel plots in neighboring Demerara over the previous few decades, in which both drivers and national organizations had been implicated. In 1789, 7 drivers from 4 plantations on Demerara's west coast launched a bloody rebellion, only to be overpowered and then hunted down. In the wake of the failed rebellion, thousands of enslaved people were forced to witness 2 days of public torture and execution as some 3,000 convicted rebels were flogged, hanged, and broken on the wheel. In 1804, colonial authorities responded with alarm to reports that enslaved Africans from multiple plantations on Demerara River were gathering or forming a combination which seemed of a very dangerous nature. They had purportedly appointed national leaders for the purpose of exercising themselves in the handling of arms. Those involved identified as members of multiple nations, including Congo, Igbo, and Coromantee. Dismissing participants' claims that the only purpose of such organizing was to arrange care for the sick and organize burials, authorities arrested and interrogated about a dozen men, including 2 drivers. 6 of them were ultimately deported and sold into slavery elsewhere. An investigation in 1808 about yet another rebel plot illustrates how enslaved people kept alive memories of previous rebel organizing. In May, a panicked plantation manager told Demerara's governor that he had learned of a plot thanks to Francina, an enslaved woman he owned. According to her, the would-be rebels, which included several drivers and her own father, Valentine, planned to rise on Whit Sunday, kill their enslavers, and divide the colony's plantations among themselves. Officials arrested and interrogated the suspected ringleaders or chiefs of the national intended revolt, but found no evidence to support Francina's claims. They did, however, uncover evidence that enslaved people remembered quite accurately what happened in previously discovered rebellions, particularly the one 4 years earlier. Valentine admitted that he had often talked to his daughter on the subject of what he called die Hauwerti, meaning the circumstances which took place 3 or 4 years before, when Maurice of Plantation Success, one of the alleged ringleaders of the 1804 plot, and other Negroes were sent out of the colony. For many enslaved people, such recent reminders that rebellions were hard to keep secret and would be brutally suppressed were reason enough to keep their distance from national organizing in 1813. One man said he did not like the Demerara story and therefore would have nothing to do with national groups. He also warned that the head driver where he lived that if white people heard about slaves being appointed as national leaders, they would say Negroes go to rise. A Congo leader on the Quarantine Coast remembered that story brought a hell of a trouble in Demerara. Susanna also remembered that the Demerara business beginning the same way, and the trouble and banishment that it led to. That was why, when the men who gathered at her house at Christmas began to discuss the King business, she broke up the meeting and told them she would not allow them to bring such matters into her house, as she knew it would bring trouble. For drivers, the stakes of being connected to anything that resembled the Demerara story were especially high. In some cases, drivers warned enslaved people on the plantations where they lived not to take part. On Plantation Britannia, when a driver heard from another enslaved man about meetings organized by the head driver of another plantation, he cautioned him to have no hand in subsequent assemblies. A driver on one Quarantine Coast plantation refused to accept an appointment as fiscal from Caesar because he personally knew 2 men who had been punished for having been connected with a business of the same kind some time ago in Demerara. So determined was he to avoid getting involved that he threatened Caesar that if he ever gave him that name again, he would challenge Caesar to single combat. Drivers' concerns were well-founded. In some cases, would-be rebels who hoped to recruit drivers explicitly referenced the crushed rebellions in Demerara. On the West Coast, when 4 men from Plantation Washington told Joseph, the head driver on Plantation Hope, that they wanted to make him a king in the Mandingo Nation, they spoke about the Demerara business. Joseph replied that he wanted nothing to do with that trouble. He knew white men would not like it and would think the Negroes want to take the colony from them. Such hesitation from the very people with the leadership skills and authority to organize a rebel coalition and lead a war proved to be a major obstacle for Congo Sam and other big men from Washington as they sought to extend their network and recruit other leaders. Even drivers who initially seemed receptive sometimes turned out to be anything but, as illustrated by the efforts to recruit Romeo, the head driver from the plantation Kingeli. Romeo agreed to host a large dinner for Congo Sam and other headmen from Washington and neighboring plantations. A couple of weeks into the new year, Romeo provided a supper hog and fowl to the delegates from nearby plantations. After supper, they all found themselves into a rank, witnesses recalled, except for the Washington leaders who paraded before them. Once all the gentlemen had gathered around the principal table and began to talk about this business, the Washington Congos told the King Ellie driver that they intended to make him king of the Congos. They offered him gifts, silver coins, paper money, and rum to persuade him to accept, but he had no interest in doing so. Congo Sam and the others, however, pressed him so hard that they provoked a great disturbance, which nearly ended in blows. Finally, Congo Sam struck his breast and announced that he would be king himself, even as Romeo drove them away, saying he wanted nothing to do with the story and to keep it on their own estates. Congo Sam told everyone to sup with him at Washington the following Saturday, when they would arrange matters properly. Other drivers, meanwhile, welcomed talk of rebellion and even became eager rebel leaders. Among them were two of Alexander's fellow drivers on Plantation Bath, which had emerged as a central site of rebel organizing around Christmas. One driver, known by the Akan day name Kamina, but identified as Cape Lahu from the eastern Windward Coast, was recruited by one of the major organizers from Plantation, Washington. Washington's second driver was a Congo man named Romeo. Asked Kamina, "Have you, in your quarter, begun to make the same law that we have in this neighborhood?" Romeo clarified that the law meant making kings, governors, and other appointed officials, and that the purpose of such appointments was to organize people on different estates for war. "We mean," he told Kamina, "to take the country for ourselves and drive white man out." Kamina was receptive, but told Romeo he needed to relay the message to the big man on Bath, a conga driver named John. As it turned out, John had already been approached by another national leader on Plantation Golden Grove. Sometime before Christmas, Kwashi, the head driver on Golden Grove, and a major Coromantee leader asked John to help him get rid of the manager on his plantation. Kwashi sought John's help because he was known as a wizard or practitioner of Obeah. Between Christmas and into the new year, he sent a series of messages to John, including a woman named Queen, who was John's countrywoman. She offered to give John some hogs if he provided something to make the manager so sick that he would be obliged to quit the place or die. After initially refusing to help, John sent a stick with some sort of material stuffed inside to Kwashi, who then placed it along the side dam where the manager would, they hoped, trip on it and suffer the consequences. Back on Bath, the process of organizing for rebellion had accelerated after the death of John's child, unnamed in the records that survive. At Christmas, at the child's funeral, John and his fellow Congas decided that they needed to follow other nations and appoint officers, even though they were from different parts of the Windward Coast. John worked closely with Kamina and another driver and fellow Conga, Jean Bart, or Jean Bart, to organize a series of meetings over the following days and weeks so that they could make this law. However vague their intentions were at first, John and Camina soon revealed their plans and made it clear that everyone would have to choose whether to cooperate with them or face the consequences. At one meeting, Camina reportedly said that since they were ill-treated by the whites, it would be good to fight them. They would also hold anyone who did not join them accountable. When one man refused to attend a meeting, telling Camina that he was tired after Bakra work all day and had no interest in whatever they were going to talk about, Camina said, "Very well, Daddy, you who mind Bakra will, when story comes on the plantation with Bakra, suffer." Drivers like Camina were, of course, accustomed to threatening others to get their way. If there was any doubt that the story would entail, Camina and John clarified it in a later meeting. "Country people," John said, "if you all join in this business, we shall get better by doing the same story also done in Demerara." John would be governor and Camina would be fiscal, John declared. John then declared, "We will take the country to ourselves and become our own masters." With that, according to Jean Bart, all the Negroes assented with a nod, saying it was good. Bart himself, however, had supposedly entered into this business under the impression that the appointments of chiefs and governors was only to provide festivals. Once he learned that a rising would take place, he drew back. To put their plan into action, John, Camina, and the other rebels on Bath took an elderly man from Plantation Bel Air, a short distance to the west, named Banaba, or Namwe. He was the head carpenter on Bel Air, and like John, a Kanga. Banaba was, John and others on Bath had decided, to be their king. But when John told Banaba that they had appointed him, he was reluctant to accept. He was too old, and perhaps more important, if such story reached the white people, they would think something bad. Banaba may have hesitated for the same reason John and others saw him as a natural choice for king. He had survived the largest rebellion in the colony's history in 1763, when the rebels took control of most of the colony for more than a year. At that time, Banaba would have been a young boy or teenager, and he may not have fought with the rebels himself. But 50 years later, he was widely known throughout the West Coast, in Camina's words, as an old fight man in former times. Among Banaba's memories of the 1763 rebellion was the time he had been forced to watch the Dutch authorities drag dozens of convicted rebels into a clearing behind the burned sugar mill on Plantation Daggerrod for public execution. There, enslaved victims were hanged, broken alive on the wheel, and burned at the stake. Such memories must have weighed heavily on Banaba's but Banaba ultimately accepted the appointment. He may have concluded that at his advanced age he had little to lose if they failed. He was, he said, an old man, and one way or another it was likely he should soon die. And he almost certainly knew, as enslaved people throughout the Americas did, that while the 1763 had failed, rebels in Haiti had succeeded just 10 years earlier, offering a dramatic example that a war against slavery could be won. Once Barnaba took on the role of king, he began coordinating with national leaders on Bath as well as other plantations. They forged plans for war during a series of clandestine nighttime meetings, some on Bel-Air, some on other plantations. And by early February 1814, they were all but ready to fight. Officers had been appointed on more than half a dozen plantations across the West Coast. Several big men had pledged their support. The dry season was approaching, and it would soon be easier to move over land, and white authorities apparently had no idea what their enslaved people were planning. To launch the rebellion, Barnaba just needed one more thing, a jug of rum. Presumably, he planned to hold a loyalty oath ceremony where rebel leaders would bind themselves and their followers together and accept that breaking the oath would result in death. As soon as the rum came from Demerara, Kamina said Barnaba would settle the story. Unfortunately, it took too long for the rum to arrive. On Monday, February 14th, as Barnaba and the others waited for the boat from Demerara that would deliver their rum, Alexander blew the whistle. He told white authorities on Bath what he had learned about the planned revolt and about the meetings that had taken place over the previous weeks. Around the same time, drivers on two other West Coast plantations, one of which was owned by the same men who owned Bath, did the same. Like many drivers who had kept their distance from national groups, especially once it became clear that plans for rebellion were underway, Alexander and the others apparently calculated that a rebellion was not in their best interest. Exactly why is unclear, but they must have weighed many factors. They may have suspected that rebels, especially the field laborers who would serve as soldiers, saw them not as potential leaders of a new political order, but as defenders of the status quo, and thus targets to be eliminated. They may have also known that in other revolts, from the 1763 Berbice Rebellion to the Haitian Revolution, drivers had been killed, sometimes beheaded, by the rebels. Their status as big men did not necessarily qualify them to lead others toward freedom. Deeply personal motivations may have also played a role in drivers' decisions to betray the rebel plot. In Alexander's case, informing on his fellow driver Kamina in particular may have been easier given the personal animosity between the two men, which apparently stemmed in part from an incident in which Kamina flogged one of Alexander's children. Alexander and others also had to consider the consequence of a protracted war for their large families. By 1814, Alexander had 8 children with his wife Juno, 6 children with a woman named Nellie, and several grandchildren. Jean Bart, similarly, had 2 children each with 2 different women, both identified as his wife, 4 children with another woman, and many grandchildren. What might happen, they must have worried, to their many family members if war broke out? As they may have known, during the last major rebellion in 1763, many non-combatant refugees especially women, had starved or been re-enslaved by rebel forces. Others had been marked as traitors and tortured or killed. Perhaps the slim chance of victory was not worth the terrifying risks. Overall, evidence suggests that in 1814, most drivers in Berbice, like most enslaved people generally, concluded that they had as much to lose as to gain by supporting the rebellion. Some historians emphasis on the exceptional drivers who led rebellions in other times and places sometimes makes it hard to recognize that most drivers, most of the time, were not rebels. Whatever factors influenced his decision, Alexander's disclosure marked the beginning of the rebellion's unraveling. The next day, the co-owner of Bath, who was also a member of the colonial government, rushed to alert the other officials. In New Amsterdam, the government convened an extraordinary meeting of the Court of Police and Criminal Justice. They discussed a report from the manager of Bath, including summaries of what Alexander and the others had said about the mediated rebellion of the Negroes and the massacre of the whites. Then they raced to develop a plan to save the colony and their own lives. For most enslaved people on Berbice's west coast, the morning of Thursday, February 17th started out like any other day. Few would have known that just 3 days earlier, Alexander and a handful of other men had told their enslavers about a rebel plot that had managed to remain a secret for months. And no one could have known that overnight the colony's fiscal militia officers and 60 soldiers, all that could be spared from the garrison, had sailed to the west coast in an effort to ambush the rebels before they could attack. So, as the sun rose and enslaved people turned out for work, there was little time to flee into the inland savannah, much less coordinate any sort of response. Before long, nearly 40 men had been arrested. Dozens of them were loaded onto a ship called the Planter, taken back to New Amsterdam, and imprisoned. The following day, colonial authorities launched a full and careful examination of the rebel plot. Bwana Haguziki, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. To take possession themselves. As the investigation expanded in the scope over the next several months, more than 100 enslaved people from the West Coast and later from the East and Quarantine Coast were interrogated. They were cross-examined, confronted with testimony from other prisoners, pressured to confess, and in some cases, offered pardons or reduced sentences in exchange for information. For everyone, the stakes were literally life and death. They knew that if they were implicated in the rebellion, they were likely to be gruesomely tortured or even executed. What witnesses revealed or chose not to reveal reflected their varying degrees of involvement and their calculated decisions about how they might best protect themselves and those they cared about. Some witnesses said they knew nothing about the rebel plot, entirely plausible for some and obviously untrue for others. Others admitted that nations had been organized, night meetings had taken place, and officers had been appointed, but they insisted that those activities had nothing to do with rebellion. Others said that there had been plenty of talk about rebellion, but that they had kept their distance. And some witnesses admitted, a few from the very beginning, others in the last-minute confessions in jail or on the gallows, that they had played key roles in organizing a very real rebellion. In their relentless effort to find sufficient evidence that they had identified the ringleaders and knew whom to punish, colonial authorities did not produce a single coherent narrative of the rebellion's making or aims. Many of the questions they asked, moreover, reflected their own fears rather than actual developments. Early rumors that the rebels' plot stretched across the entire colony and even to Demerara, or that rebels planned to rape white women, were never substantiated, even when prisoners were explicitly asked about such things. Authorities similarly failed to find any evidence that the rebels had coordinated with Berbice's Maroons, a persistent fear for a government embroiled in a seemingly endless bush expeditions to eradicate elusive Maroon encampments in the coastal hinterland. Authorities did, however, document tantalizing glimpses of enslaved people's contested rebel politics. The investigation ultimately revealed that the rebellion's leaders, drivers, and other big men had a distinct political vision. That vision was informed by their collective memory of previous struggles against white enslavers, as well as their own position at the top of the slave community's hierarchy. As in other driver-led rebellions, the drivers who planned to rebel in 1814 aimed to spark a revolution that would serve their interests rather than those of ordinary enslaved people. Having necessarily recruited and retained followers in order to do their day-to-day job, such drivers seemingly abandoned or betrayed them. An especially revealing moment in the investigation came during one of several examinations of a man named Liverpool, who testified that he had heard stories about the nearly successful rebellion of 1763, the largest slave revolt in the Caribbean before the Haitian Revolution. Liverpool told the court that John, one of the drivers on Bath who helped plan the 1814 rebellion, told him how the revolt was carried on there formerly. John, in turn, had learned about the 1763 rebellion from an old man on Bel-Air. No doubt this was Banaba. As Liverpool testified, he had heard that in 1763 the blacks got possession of the country and they kept it till they began to quarrel amongst themselves and the whites took possession again. During the rebellion, the Congos fought against the Coromantese, the Mandingos against others, and then, when the whites came, they caught them one by one and destroyed them. We need to remember that lesson. The basic contours of this account corresponded to what historians know about the 1763 rebellion. After taking control of plantations throughout the colony, rebels split into factions as competing leaders advocated for different strategies and political visions. At one point, the rebellion's original leader, a Coromantee who negotiated with Dutch authorities and proposed that they divide the colony into two, was overthrown by a rival coalition of Coromantees and Gango, or likely Congo or Congo leaders. Such infighting, which escalated into a sort of civil war, ultimately made it easier for Dutch soldiers and their indigenous allies to crush the rebellion and regain control of the colony. By 1813, there were only a handful of elders like Banaba who could personally remember the 1763 rebellion. By then, almost every enslaved adult in Berbice had been born elsewhere, most of them in Africa, and arrived decades after the rebellion. And yet, the events of 1763 and its aftermath remained alive in enslaved people's collective memory for generations, thanks to the efforts of survivors like Banaba, who taught newcomers the local history of resistance to slavery. Such insurgent memories became a key part of enslaved people's political imagination, shaping the ways that they understood their situation, as well as the strategies they developed to survive, resist, and rebel. For many people, the rebellion that almost happened in 1814 was not a spontaneous outburst of rage, nor was it sparked by any single grievance or immediate development. Indeed, several witnesses described it as the latest battle in an ongoing war against slavery, or, in their words, as the renewal of earlier battles that stretched back more than half a century. The 1814 rebellion thus formed part of what political theorist Cedric Robinson described as the Black radical tradition, or an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. The memory of the 1763 rebellion that enslaved people kept alive emphasized three basic lessons. First, rebelling carried major risks. Those who rebelled in 1763, along with many bystanders, suffered horrific violence at the hands of white authorities. Second, the 1763 rebellion had nearly succeeded. For more than a year, the rebels controlled most of the colony and held their Dutch enemies at bay. And third, that rebellion ultimately failed because the rebels lacked martial skill or courage, not because the rebels lacked martial skill or courage, but because of internal divisions. That has got to be so defeating to hear, listen to, and internalize. In 1813 to 1814, such divisions were ironically an inherent byproduct of the strategy that would-be rebel leaders used to mobilize other enslaved people. Leaders knew, it seemed, that it would take deliberate effort to combine a variety of national groups whose members were spread across different plantations with their own leaders and hierarchies into a cohesive rebel coalition. From the beginning, many leaders worked not only to organize their own people, but also to get Africans from different regions and on different plantations to do the same. Before long, Africans from more than half a dozen distinct national groups were communicating and cooperating. At the same time, some leaders advocated for a level of flexibility in regulating membership in the nations they led, allowing Africans from other nations to participate in their activities. Sibley, the driver who also was the head man of the Chamba Nation, or on the Quarantine Coast, wanted to include a small number of Coromantese there in the Chamba Nation. Pompey, the driver who served as the king of the Mandingo Nation on the west coast, included people identified as Fulas and Bambaras in his meetings. On Bath, Congas and Le Cape Hoos were included in the same gatherings. Meanwhile, other leaders talked explicitly about the need for Pan-African solidarity. One witness recalled that when three big men from Washington, including second driver Romeo, who had been appointed the Congo nation's fiscal, recruited him, they told him they aimed to form one great engine and to do away with all distinctions between different nations. Pan-Africanism or perish was a thought that enslaved people had in 1813 and 1814. Rebel leaders were united by a widely shared goal, as horrified colonial officials confirmed during their investigation, to kill the colony's white inhabitants. Repeatedly, witnesses described what white authorities, still shaken by the success of the Haitian Revolution barely a decade earlier, viewed as a race war. Witnesses described plans that involved not targeted violence against especially hated enslavers, but rather the wholesale slaughter of white residents. They planned, as the rebel leader Thomas put it, to march straight to town and fight with the white people. On Washington's, Pompey's mind was bent on war. On Bath, Comuna and John told their followers that the rebel plot was not confined to Bath and neighboring plantations, and that they were to fight and kill the whites. Other witnesses explained that their goal was to do what the rebels in Demerara had tried to do a few years earlier, aware that the Demerara story was a common reference point, especially for Berbice's governor, who had been governor of Demerara during the 1808 conspiracy, and in November of 1813, just after he had arrived in Berbice, received news from the acting governor of Demerara, Essequibo, of an alleged rebel plot there. As one rebel put it, white men oppressed them, so they wanted to renew now the same fight they had with the white men in Demerara. After killing the colony's whites, what did the rebels plan to do? Some authorities assumed they planned to destroy plantations and abolish slavery. Officials asked Jean Bart, one of the drivers on Bath and among the first witnesses to offer detailed information about the rebel plot, if the rebels planned to burn the estates, a common tactic for rebels across the Atlantic world. Bart's answer must have shocked his captors. No, he said, they intended only to take the possessions themselves. Other witnesses confirmed that rebel leaders planned to take over rather than destroy the colony's plantation system. Alexander said the rebels' goal was nothing less than the overthrow of the whites and the establishment of authority of the blacks. Kamina similarly said that after the rebels had defeated Buckra, Barnaba and John were to take the country. An enslaved carpenter admitted that they had organized and appointed kings, governors, fiscals, and other officers for the purpose of commanding the estates. And as white authorities were terrified to learn, some leaders had already made plans for dividing up plantation property and government buildings. According to Bacchus, also enslaved on Bath, at one meeting on the plantation, the driver John announced that after the rebellion, he would get the plantation's 2 warehouses, while his fellow driver Kamina would get the sick house and the cotton gin. And after white authorities were dead, according to Thomas, the head driver on Union, old Barnaba would appropriate the governor's official residence for himself and live in government house. Rebel leaders did not, however, seek a complete inversion of social hierarchies. The drivers and big men who organized the rebellion assumed that in the new society they created, they would naturally be on top. In the lead up to war, rebel leaders had drawn explicit distinctions between leaders and followers, elites and commoners. Much like the driving system, they would be officers, while everyone else, the field people or low-class Negroes, would be soldiers. Repeatedly, leaders insisted that all soldiers were to obey officers. As Congo Sam explained, the common Negroes were to be soldiers, and any orders given by the officers to the soldiers must be obeyed. By all accounts, the men who planned the rebellion had no intention of sharing power with women. They had not included enslaved women in their meetings or appointed them as officers. Even the wives, sisters, and daughters of the major leaders do not appear to have had any formal role in the rebellion itself or in laying plans for the future. Some enslaved women may have chosen to distance themselves too, seeing little to gain and much to lose in a big man's rebellion that was likely to perpetuate rather than challenge existing gender hierarchies. Ultimately, it seems that the rebel leaders envisioned that many of the social hierarchies of colonial slave society would continue after rebellion, as would slavery. Rather than either abolish the plantation system and the coerced labor that made it possible, or flee into the bush and establish autonomous maroon communities, drivers and their allies would simply take over the existing plantation infrastructure. In this respect, their goals were strikingly similar to those of many leaders of the 1763 rebellion, where drivers had also played key roles. No doubt, some people in Berbice had heard that when the rebels took control 50 years earlier, they had forced enslaved people to continue working on the plantations they controlled. Some would have also known about the foiled rebel plot in 1804 Demerara, where 2 of the main organizers, one who identified as Coromantee and the other as an Igbo, both claimed that they owned slaves. By 1813, enslaved Berberians had also all but certainly heard about the Haitian Revolution, where newly freed Haitians sought liberty and autonomy as peasant farmers, only to be forced back into plantation labor by elites who were determined to resume the export-oriented sugar economy. In the end, the kind of political vision at the center of the rebellion clearly appealed to some drivers and other big men, but must have had little appeal to most ordinary enslaved people. Nearly 200 years after the failed 1814 rebellion, a remarkable artifact turned up for sale in a London auction house. A silver medal originally given to Alexander, the driver on Bath, for his faithful service to the colony of Berbice in disclosing a rebel plot. A similar medal presented to an enslaved man named February, who was a field laborer on a neighboring plantation called Catharinesburg, owned by the same men as Bath, was auctioned by Sotheby's in 1903. In all, 6 such medals were awarded in August of 1814 by Berbice's colonial government to the trusty individuals who had suppressed the rebellion. Those 6 men, 4 of whom lived on Bath and 2 of whom worked as drivers, also received other tangible rewards, including sizable cash payments and, in Alexander's case, a silver-headed cane. In addition to honoring Alexander and the others for their fidelity, those rewards were intended to promote similar good conduct at any future period in other Negroes. To receive his medal, Alexander traveled from Bath to New Amsterdam for a solemn ceremony. As members of the colonial government looked on, the governor presented Alexander with the cane and medal as rewards for his meritorious conduct. Alexander thanked the officials and pledged his fidelity. There, surrounded by grateful white authorities who credited him with having saved their lives, the medal may have reassured Alexander that he made the right decision. Betraying the rebel plot allowed him to keep his coveted role as head driver and gave his enslavers strong incentives to see him as someone they could trust and presumably someone who deserved special accommodations. Back on Plantation Bath, however, the medal's meaning was more ambiguous. Did Alexander wear it proudly, seeing it as an additional mark of his special status as head driver and big man? Perhaps he also thought it might intimidate the people he supervised, or at least encourage them to follow his orders, since it was a tangible sign that he was willing to enlist the crushing power of the plantation regime against his adversaries. Or maybe Alexander stashed the medal away, out of sight, because he knew that for many people it was a bitter reminder that he had betrayed a rebellion that might have liberated them. Whatever meanings Alexander and other enslaved people attached to the medals and other conspicuous rewards distributed to those who had disclosed the rebels' plans, they were part of the colonial officials' broader effort to construct a reassuring narrative about the events of 1813 and 1814. From the beginning of their investigation, white authorities tried to see the rebel plot as a temporary aberration, the result of some discrete event or individual outrage. They sought answers that would make the threat seem containable. Instead, witnesses told them what they did not want to hear. As one man put it, the rebels' motivation stemmed not from bad treatment, though there was plenty of that, but from their own hearts. The planned rebellion of 1814 was nothing more and nothing less than what historian Vincent Brown has described as the natural consequence of slavery itself, the latest battle in a perpetual war. And yet, officials ignored their own evidence and embraced a different narrative. They told themselves that the foiled rebellion was not a sign of discontent among the enslaved as a whole, but rather the work of a few unworthy miscreants. They found it especially irrational that drivers and other enslaved men with high-ranking positions, had decided to rebel despite widespread knowledge that drivers throughout the Atlantic world had joined and led rebellions for centuries. As whites saw it, drivers had received the kindest treatment and attention and still, for some reason, organized against their enslavers and misguided others into following them. And while the would-be rebels nearly exposed the colony to a repetition of those horrors rendered at Saint-Domingue, by then notorious among the whites as a scene of blood and devastation, they had been thwarted by people like Alexander. A few of the more worthy part of the black population, as the fiscal described them, had been motivated by sentiments of fidelity and affection to their masters to betray the rebellion. Colonial authorities thus reassured themselves that there was no systemic problem, no ongoing threat, that the plantation economy remained secure, and that the driving system worked. Authorities' fears, however, were belied by the extraordinary effort mere months later they had put into making an example of the many people implicated so as to deter others from similar acts of rebellion. Beginning in April, when the trials of the rebels from the West Coast concluded, colonial officials launched a carefully calibrated campaign of terror. 11 of the people they convicted would never even be allowed to return to the plantations to which they belonged, where they had friends and kin. Instead, after being whipped and branded before onlookers in the center of New Amsterdam, they were banished or sold into slavery elsewhere. The nearly 30 men who did return to their plantations brought with them visible reminders of the violence of colonial authorities that had subjected them to, nursing fresh wounds from severe floggings and lugging heavy iron chains they would not be released from for half a year. The starkest reminders of the colonial government's response to the foiled rebellion, however, were the severed heads of the ringleaders, Banaba and 5 drivers, Quashie from Golden Grove, Thomas from Union, Pompey from Washington, and Kamina and John from Bath, were convicted of treason, and publicly executed by hanging. After their lifeless bodies swung from the gallows for an hour, they were cut down and then decapitated. Next, the corpses were taken to Crab Island in the middle of the Berbice River, where it empties into the Atlantic, and buried beyond the reach of those who mourned them. The rebels' heads, however, were taken back to the plantations where they had lived until they were captured 2 months earlier. There, they were impaled on poles as an awful example of what happened to rebels left to remain until destroyed by birds of prey. Ironically, authorities' own investigation had revealed that such efforts to terrorize enslaved people into submission were doomed to fail. So too were their efforts to control enslaved people's political imagination. That many enslaved people remembered all too well the failed rebellion of 1763, the more recent Demerara plots, and the brutal oppression that followed every war against slavery, and nevertheless decided to rebel in 1814, suggests that the lessons they drew from previous struggles were different from the ones their enslavers hoped to convey. The investigation into the 1813-1814 rebel conspiracy also shows us that the enslaved knew all too well just how hard it was to organize a successful war against slavery. In Berbice and enslaved societies throughout the Americas, rebellions failed for many reasons. Among them, as the evidence from Berbice illustrates, was the fact that enslaved people were often divided on crucial questions of organization, leadership, and political goals. So those are 3 things you got to get right when you're organizing. You got to get your organizational structure down pat, your leadership structure down pat, and your organizational goals down pat. And everybody needs to agree on what those 3 things are. Would-be rebels everywhere face the challenge of organizing large numbers of people spread across large territories. One of the most effective ways of doing so was to leverage existing national associations or create new ones in order to gather and strategize at national assemblies. The inherent risk of creating political communities based on distinct national identities, however, was that it reified ethnic and political divisions when broad solidarity was needed. Power struggles within the individual nations created further internal fissures that made rebellions even harder to organize. Successful rebellions also needed capable leaders. Among the most qualified were African-born drivers who had precisely the kind of social authority and leadership skills to mobilize and command the masses. Most drivers, however, tended to be deeply invested in their own position and status, and as a result, were often lukewarm or even hostile to the prospect of a destabilizing rebellion. They stood to lose more than most enslaved people if a rebellion failed, which helps to explain why most drivers either dodged rebellions or, like Alexander, they undermined them. While drivers were ideally positioned to lead wars against the plantation regime, those who did so were exceptional. To generate and maintain broader support, rebel leaders also needed a compelling political vision. Everyone could agree that overthrowing white enslavers and colonial authorities was a worthy goal. But when it came to questions about how society should be organized, enslaved people were as deeply divided as all potential revolutionaries. One problem when drivers and other big men led rebellions was that their political goals reflected their own desire to remain in positions of power rather than the concerns and aims of ordinary enslaved people. Drivers certainly wanted freedom for themselves, but not necessarily to an end to plantation political structures and social hierarchies, or even the coerced labor aspects. Anyone who sought a truly radical liberating revolution would have to look to other leaders. And finally, the conclusion. At the heart of the driving system was the essential horror of modern capitalism. In the early 1780s, nearly 90 years before Karl Marx published Das Kapital, which was written in 1867, a head driver on a Jamaican sugar plantation named Frisco explained the system's brutal dynamics. The field laborers Francisco supervised already worked harder than any other Negroes on any estates roundabout, but the overseer wanted more work out of him and the Negroes than he was able to make them do, and more indeed than was right, and more than they were able to do. So Francisco learned that when the overseer was watching, he had to swear and tear at his fellow slaves in a futile effort to extract more work from them than was possible. What do we gain by putting the driving system at the center of Atlantic slavery's history? In addition to a better understanding of how the plantation system worked on the ground and how people dealt with extreme forms of exploitation and oppression, the driver story helps us see more clearly how the institution of slavery endured for so long despite enslaved people's repeated efforts to destroy it. If slavery was a never-ending state of war, and the stories told here suggest that it was, why did enslaved people find victory elusive? Prevailing approaches to the study of Atlantic slavery have offered incomplete answers. Part of the problem is that scholarship has generally been bifurcated. As the historian Vincent Brown observed, trends in the study of slavery, as with the study of dominance more generally, often divide between works between works that emphasize the overwhelming power of the institution and scholarship that focuses on the resistant efforts of the enslaved. Scholars writing in both traditions have given us sophisticated understandings of the many ways enslavers flexed their power and the many ways enslaved people subverted their enslavers' control and fought for freedom. Nonetheless, the durability of the plantation regime calls for more explanation. With the critical exception of the Haitian Revolution, enslaved people's tenacious efforts to overthrow their enslavers were unsuccessful. Focusing on drivers and the driving system offers one path forward and an opportunity to integrate the methods and findings of the two dominant approaches to the study of slavery. Drivers stood at the epicenter of the daily war between the enslavers and the enslaved. They had to strike an impossible balance between the insatiable labor demands of their enslavers and the constant resistance of other enslaved people. Understanding the driver's world, then, helps us to better understand how strategies of coercion and strategies of subversion developed in response to one another, and ultimately, why the balance of power tilted toward the enslavers. It also lets us see how these power dynamics, too easily reduced to abstractions, play out in the messy everyday interactions among individuals. Enslavers embraced the driving system because it helped them manage their fundamental problem: how to extract labor from people who had every reason to resist. The system worked because enslavers coerced and incentivized drivers to perform the dangerous, difficult job of front-line labor management and discipline. Drivers proved to be brutally effective in crushing resistance from below. They accepted the fraught requirements of the job in part because they saw that in a world where enslaved people were treated as disposable, escape was all but impossible, and rebellion seemed suicidal. Being a driver was one of the only ways to survive. The work of drivers was less physically debilitating. They had better access to food and other scarce material resources. They also gained social influence within their communities, which they used to build families and accrue wealth in people. In short, they used the prerequisites of their position to forge longer lives and build social ties. At the same time, drivers refused to be turned into mere agents of planter power, and they remained deeply embedded in their communities. Drivers saw themselves and were seen by others as leaders and sometimes protectors. As big men, they stood up for their people, helping enslaved workers protest egregious abuses, negotiate labor demands, and secure customary rights to essentials like food and rest. They used their discretion to turn a blind eye to minor acts of resistance and mitigated the violence their enslavers expected them to inflict. Sometimes they tolerated and even encouraged strikes, work slowdowns, and desertions. As fathers and husbands, drivers helped themselves and others to resist the persistent threats of social death and natal alienation by finding connection and kinship. They were among the only enslaved men to establish polygynous families and marriages to which African men aspired. Drivers served as kings and other crucial leaders of diasporic African nations that helped enslaved people create a sense of belonging and provided mutual aid across plantations. Sometimes, drivers even organized and led large-scale rebellions. Taken together, the personal relationships drivers cultivated within the slave community make clear that for them, being a driver meant more than being an enforcer of labor discipline. In relying on a subset of enslaved people for labor extraction and social control, enslavers created a volatile system. They knew that drivers' interests were not the same as their own, and that there was always a risk that drivers would collaborate with other enslaved people to sabotage or destroy the very system they had been appointed to support. To coerce drivers into doing their job, enslavers subjected them to constant surveillance and brutal discipline. Even when drivers tested the limits of their enslavers' power with quiet acts of insubordination and open defiance. And yet, the driving system proved effective and resilient. It has survived the many attacks against it, enriching enslavers and extracting a terrible toll on drivers and other enslaved people alike. Among its most insidious effects was the way it created or reified hierarchies and divisions among the enslaved, pushing drivers and the people they supervised to see one another more as adversaries than allies. Then, as now, the ruling class maintained power in part by getting oppressed people to focus on internal conflicts rather than to unite against their common enemy. It is tempting to see the driving system as the epitome of slavery's backwardness. That is how many of its contemporary critics saw it. When British anti slavery activists denounced the horrors of the driving system, for instance, they did so to expose the barbarity of a world where production relied on brute force and terror. Excuse me. For the abolitionist James Stephen, the odious practice of driving was both unspeakably cruel and destructive to the slaves, and the most peculiar characteristic of West Indian slavery. At the time, many people liked to imagine that the driving system was a perverse feature of primitive plantation societies that would disappear after slavery was abolished. Whips were replaced with wages, and new models of labor management took hold. In reality, the driving system, a system designed precisely to push workers to their utter limits, was a harbinger of modern labor exploitation. Indeed, many of the quintessential features of capitalism as we know it today, the never ending drive to maximize production and increase profits, the insatiable demands made of laborers' bodies and times, the relentless surveillance and supervision of work, and the crucial role of coercion took shape on plantations across the Americas generations before the Industrial Revolution. In the end, the driving system was, as the Guyanese historian and activist Walter Rodney described the slave trade, simply capitalism without a loincloth. And that is the end of the book. What do you think? So, as you can see, we still exist within these paradigms today because those that hold the whip don't want to let it go because they are receiving some level of material benefit for themselves. As Bwana Haguziki says, you got to change the institutions or you will end up with the same results, just different people governing it. And that is so true when we look at the driving system and when we look at all systems of employment and labor extraction from people. They haven't necessarily changed anything. They've called it different names. They don't whip us with chains and whips anymore. They don't punish us in the same way, but they give us social death, economic death, because they hold our very lives in their hands. Give me one moment. Greetings, Bawana Haguziki. How are you this evening?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm good, Matron. How are you today?
I'm good.
Okay. What do you think about the book? What do you think about
I think that he's hiding some things, like he doesn't talk about buck breaking as one of the strategies and techniques that they used. He calls it driver breaking, and he makes out like it was just the physical public punishment and humiliation. He doesn't talk about the rape and the castigation that occurred with these people. He doesn't talk about a lot of things that are the gory, ugly aspects of driving. And with his bend towards capitalism is bad, he doesn't fully explain and understand to us that external capitalism is a good thing as long as it's not within your social environment. And internal socialism is an answer for us. But it was overall an okay read. It was interesting to look at some of the parallels between the modern day and the actual slave system itself, to just recognize that we're still living within that system. We haven't really changed much of anything.
it? So here's where I am with this.
Hmm.
I want to first start with the author of the book. Okay.
Hmm.
So the author of the book is obviously he's a white male, white American male. I was
Hmm.
trying to see exactly where he was from, but I am curious as to why a particular person like him would want to talk about the particularities of slavery in the West Indies. What is his motivation in doing that? I'm very curious about that. See, the other guy, um, what's the thing what Trump did? 2025,
Hmm.
the memorandum for 2025.
Hmm.
He also had a PhD and in history, and his main focus also was in slavery as well. And I'm curious about why all these white males are so curious about the slave system, either in the South or the Caribbean. I have a curiosity in that. Needless to say, when he talks about the driver, he does talk about the complexities of the roles of the driver, and the fact that the driver took different kind of roles within the plantation system, and also he kind of like vacillated in between the two worlds of the slave master and the slaves themselves. But I don't particularly care for his conclusion. It's almost as if he is venerating the driver, and I don't really share that view. I don't like his conclusions. I understand when you say he was being fair or you liked it or whatever, but I think that his conclusions kind of like tipped the scale on the side where he was almost venerating the driver. And I think that the position of the driver itself was to be a jailer. He is a jailer at the end of the day. People talk about this benevolent slave master and all these other things. He is a jailer. He is containing the souls, the hearts, and the minds of people who really want to be free. Now, sometimes he took on the position of leading these kinds of expeditions and trying to get slaves to be free. But at the end of the day, he was a driver. And when they got their freedom, in instances of Haiti and other places, they didn't want to upset the institutions. They wanted to maintain the institutions, just change the faces of the people. They would be in charge as opposed to the slave master. But even if you replace the slave master and keep the institutions the same way, the results will continue to be the same, which is the exploitation of black people. So I don't really care about the I have an issue with the role of the driver. Like I say, I understand there's a complexity in his job situation and uh, 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 what he was supposed to do or what he was told to do. But ultimately, the driver had a boss, and this unseen hand in these readings, this unseen hand, even though you mentioned it throughout the book, this unseen hand was really the battery in the driver's back in the exploitation of black people.
Hmm.
And I think that there's something that should be said in that. And I think that I'm hearing a lot of the content erring on the side of the fact that the driver was trying to be just and all that. No, at the end of the day, he is a jailer. He's a jailer, and I think that yes, this white man is writing the story, but the devil gonna always come out, man. I swear to God, he's always gonna come out. If the devil is in the deed, if you read that carefully, he's always gonna err on the side of the devil. It is what it is. It is what it is. And slavery had a devilish nature to it. And even if you put in the fact that there was some references of fairness and equality and trying to walk a narrow line and practice fairness with the slaves while showing his fierce nature to the slave master, at the end of the day, he is still a jailer. What do you say to that?
I agree with you. I think that the author has a lot of sympathy and empathy for the driver. He is putting, as he's trying to express a centering of the driver, I think that he's trying to humanize, similarly to other authors, like in Thistlewood's case, where they try to humanize these demons. I think that um, unfortunately, those that hold the whip don't want to let it go because they're getting some meager material benefits as well. And we don't explore that aspect of it enough because earlier in the story, it talks about a driver whose daughter was raped, and the Christian missionaries that he went to complain about this issue documented the fact that it was his daughter's own fault and did nothing to help him, even though he had helped them by pushing the Christian doctrine on his people. And so these things that drivers do and have done in an attempt to maintain some level of material benefit for themselves is wrong. And the author doesn't call it out for what it is. He doesn't call out driving expressly for what it is. He says, "Oh, the driver is trying to balance these two worlds." And it's like, but one of these worlds shouldn't exist. The driver is trying to maintain balance and is responsible to a white colonial leadership and things like that. But at the end of the day, there's a level of selfishness that had to be involved with being a driver. There's a level of I, rugged individualism, that is involved with being a driver. All the things that we despise about modern day Black people that are in leadership positions and in role and have money and are in these roles still exist and existed within the driver capacity because they wanted to make sure they and their families were okay, and to hell with everybody else. As the author even said, that these egalitarian ideas that we have and that we share were not necessarily the motives, ideas, and motivations of drivers. They were worried about themselves and their family and how they could protect their people and the few material possessions that they were allowed to have in this system.
I want to add to that, matron. There was also a level of self-hatred within the driver, because if you think about it, the driver has to get chosen. So so when the master is picking particular Negroes, he knows within himself there are certain people on this plantation that I could trust, that I could draw close to my chest. There are certain people on this plantation, no way, I gotta watch him 24 hours a day. As you
Mhm.
see it today, our leaders sometimes, whether we notice or not, these people are selected. They can be trusted. And if you could be trusted by what the young people say, by the ops, you are
Mhm.
always my ops. You are always my ops. I don't care what face you come to me with. You could come to me with a benevolent face. You could be articulate as you want to be. You could come to me with song and dance. But if you are their best friend, you could never be my friend. Ever. Ever. So, like I say, this is the reason why, his conclusion is almost favoring this idea of the driver, and I don't see it that way. I gotta say, and like I say, he is a good writer, so he puts in the complexity or the complex nature of the different roles of the driver. But at the end of the day, he is my op. He is my enemy. He is my enemy. So I'm sorry. I just see it that way. I just see it that way.
I absolutely understand that. And I agree with that because at the end of the day, he's trying to espouse a perspective that is not going to be favorable to the empowerment of Africans everywhere. He's talking about at the end he's talking about capitalism being bad, which is like telling us it's bad to make money, right? But or it's bad to exploit the foreigner. But this is where I think the Jews get it right in their Bible. Like they can charge usury and undue usury to the foreigner. They can sell the foreigner bad meat. They can charge the foreigner a higher price, right? Whereas we always look at, oh, there's one broad brush that we paint internal and external people with. No, we first have to pick our people, and then once we pick our people, we have to favor our internal group and we have to exploit or take for as much as possible that external group. And that external group has always got to be the other. And that's unfortunately in the paradigm that we're in, the only thing that's going to work. I think that he also tries to highlight the fact that he often leans into this idea that it was an African thing to do to have these multiple families and to exploit these tribal differences. But he slips up when he says things like, oh, Pan Africanism was an idea that they had even on the plantation. Pan Africanism is something that was developed and evolved from the slave ship experiences. Pan Africanism is the thing that would have unified us all, but for these people that had this idea of rugged individualism. Am I going to be okay in this scenario where these field laborers and other drivers overthrow the system that's benefiting me? I want to say greetings to Anthony McPhail. Thanks so much for tuning in.
I also want to address this idea of punishment
Hmm.
because it's interesting uh, at the failure of the slave rebellion. The slave masters decided to really, cut off the leaders of the rebellion's head and punish them in front of the slaves. Well, in African cosmology, right? I would believe, and I could be wrong on this. Anthony is a historical person and expert in these kinds of areas, so he could correct me. But we have a different relationship in how we view death. See, pain is always going to be temporary, but after you give up the ghost, you go back to the ancestors. So, so you could cut off a person's head and then parade it around on a stake, and I understand that would drive fear in the hearts of people who don't have a relationship with death. But African people who have a relationship with death is like, you just take my physical body, but I am one with my spirit. You know what I mean? So it's like you get rid of my physical presence, but I am among who I need to be among. So we gonna still come back at you. We gonna still fight you. We gonna still wage war against you. Because all you could do is kill our physical body, and pain is always gonna be temporary. You only could kill me one time. You can kill me in front of all these people who may understand that, okay, I may not be physically present and the way I got it may be painful, but pain is a temporary experience. And after that pain subsides, I'm with my ancestors, I'm with my grandchildren, well, my great grand people, I'm with my all the people who have what I've known and left on the continent of Africa. I go back to that experience. So I mean, I just think that the slave masters may not have understood that, and sticking our head on a pike did not stop African people from fighting them. They still had the will to fight because we had a different relationship with death. What you say to that?
I agree, but I think that that's one of the reasons why it was so important for them to continue to allow these Christian missionaries onto the plantation to help espouse these ideas of Christian values and Christian ideas of heaven and hell. Because at the point that you kill off the older population and you have the children raising themselves and you have these Christian missionaries telling the children stories instead of their ancestors telling them stories, then you get a generation of people that have an unnatural fear of death. They have an unnatural understanding that's anti African. So I think that that's one of the reasons why it was so important for them to continue to have these Christian missionaries evangelizing and proselytizing to the people on the
I
plantation.
got that. Yes,
Mhm.
yes, yes. I got that. That's true. That is true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But that's really all I had, man. I appreciate, well, the book was the book. Yeah, and to me it was the middle of the road. I guess the like I say it meant it talked about the complex nature of the role of the driver. I don't particularly care for the conclusion, but
Mhm.
it was a book that you kind of I gain a lot of information from, and I'll probably have to reread it and reconsider it, and going forward. But I appreciate your time and actually spending time with the content and reading it. I can't wait to hear the next book up to bat, from Virginia.
Yes.
I want to hear what you have to say, but
Yes.
I'll just leave it there for the night, man. Thank you for this time and you reading this book, Matron.
Well, thank you for coming on and thank you for, even listening to the book and giving and sharing your opinions. Like I said, the driver is the middle manager of today. And we have to recognize and understand the roles that people are playing. It's the political mover and shaker. It's the boss. It's the supervisor instead of the executive that's disconnected. We have to get to the point where we're looking at these people for what they are and for who they are and the role that they play so that we can better understand and organize. One of the things that I noticed in the text, and I want to know if you noticed it too, was that there was always this idea of statehood and nationhood that came back into play over and over and over again in these communities. They were always making attempts at trying to organize themselves into political groups, into social groups that took care of their dead, that could organize rebellion, that took care of the sick, that did the things that made political decisions, that punished thieves, that did the things that nations would do for people even in their enslavement. They still had that drive. And one of the things that perhaps it was the welfare system, perhaps it's the continued draining and propagandization of us today that has been taken away from us is that sense of nationhood and the idea that we can organize a nation unto ourselves. What do you think about that?
No, I think that naturally, a man in his own habitat, naturally he is gonna organize under some kind of structure, and he is gonna, because Africa left alone would have been the competitive with any other nation in the world, and we would
Hmm.
have had time to build up complexities in our organization. But because our development was interrupted, we didn't have a chance to do that. But that will to do that, as men and women in this part of the world, it still existed. We still
Hmm.
talked about it, talked among one another. We still shared information and experiences. It's no, it's not a surprise to me that uh, I think that you talked about when the slave rebellions in Jamaica and things of that nature. This was
Hmm.
in 1814. Well,
Hmm.
of course, slaves talk among themselves, and slaves you could easily jump on a boat to Jamaica to get to Haiti. So I'm sure that there was a passing knowledge and information on to one another, and so, well, if the Haitians could do it, we could do it too. So that level of communication, talking, structure is always been there. But I think that many of us have not gotten the opportunity to freely do that. To freely do that. They do it in this country, but they do it in a way that still feel like we could do much more. But I think that left alone, black men and women would organize among themselves and create our own enclaves, our own nations, and we would do our own thing, left alone. But because that is always being interfered with and interrupted for whatever reason, internally and externally, I think
Uh-huh.
that you don't see these things. But of course, when mama gets old and we don't have a, because we don't pack our mama in a old folks home and things like that. We bring her, so we have to find how do we care for the old people when the young girls have children and things like that, and they don't have enough money to feed themselves. You have to create a structure and a foundation where you could protect them, you can provide them with the needs that, to raise the little babies right. These things are decided by men and women, men and women who are taught to be men and women. If we still function as children on children level, we ain't gonna give a damn. But when we develop into men and women, these are the concerns of grown men and grown women. We organize, we get together, we incentivize, and we try to push our communities forward. That's a natural thing that I feel that we should do naturally.
Well, thank you. I am glad, and I agree. I agree. I want to thank you for coming up tonight. I believe that we will be reading next Tuesday, the book coming out of Virginia from one of our very own Forecast Radio, The History of Racism, White Supremacy. I hope you enjoy it. I want to thank the Forecast for being here, the Bitter Medicine Podcast, Koku, you, Bwana Haguziki, KW Don 7, and Anthony McPhail for tuning in. I know that Real Black Gentleman is listening. Kofi the Black Critic is listening. Sister Raw and the Elders are listening. Redo 9002 are listening. And so is Brother Bakari. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. There is no show this coming Thursday. So just remember that we will be back next Tuesday at 9 p.m. Peace, guys.